Throughout history, there have been people who have committed some of the most heinous crimes fathomable. For those crimes, they have been convicted and sentenced to death. Welcome to Death Row Executions, where we take a look into the lives of society's worst offenders. And now, your host, Air.
Anthony Chebotouras was born on May 10, 1898 in Poland. He grew up with both parents, Michael and Victoria Chebotouras, and one other brother. Soon after Anthony was born, his father Michael immigrated to the United States alone in the hopes of a better life. He worked very hard for 2 years, and in 1902 he sent for his wife and sons to live with him in Trevescan, Pennsylvania. As time went on, his parents gave birth to a daughter and another son. Anthony attended school but dropped out in the 8th grade in order to start making money. His first job was working as a laborer in his hometown, but he eventually relocated to Detroit, Michigan, and began working as a chauffeur in 1919. The same year as his move, former attorney, U.S. Army veteran, and Congressman Leonidas C. Dyer created the Dyer Act, or the Motor Vehicle Theft Act, and it was put into effect in 1919. Leonidas tried reforming many issues in America, including the anti-lynching bill, and he even authored the anti-usury law. Many of the laws he helped contribute to the United States are still in effect today. The Dyer Act in particular made it a federal crime to transport a stolen vehicle across state lines. Towards the end of 1919, Anthony and his girlfriend, Catherine Boyd, conceived their first child. By March 1920, the two were married. A month before Catherine was due to give birth to their daughter Vera, Anthony, who ditched living an honest life, started hanging around the wrong crowd and was now living a life of crime. In July of 1920, he walked onto the luxury Packard automobile lot where he worked as a chauffeur and robbed a cashier who was on his way to the bank. He was not caught right away, but he was eventually apprehended, and on July 20th, 1920, he was convicted and sentenced to 8 years in prison. He spent his time at the Jackson State Prison, but was let out on parole after serving only 6 years. While in prison, Catherine left and started a new life, and Anthony was never able to meet his daughter. Fresh out of prison and with no family or support, he was right back into the same things that got him locked up 6 years prior. In 1927, he was busted for armed robbery and for stealing an automobile. He ended up crossing state lines, so because of the 1919 Dyer Act, he was charged with a federal crime and sentenced to 8 years in prison. Because of it being a federal crime, he was not eligible for parole and served his full 8-year sentence at the Marquette Branch Prison. Upon his release from prison in 1935, he was now officially divorced and had still not met his daughter. He had spent all but 6 months of her life locked up and made no effort to try to see his daughter Vera when he was released from Jackson State Prison. While being locked up at the Marquette Branch Prison, Anthony met an inmate by the name of Jack Gracie, and when Anthony stationed in Detroit, he found out that his friend was living in a nearby city. Two criminal peas in a pod conspiring and colluding. They ultimately decide that they are going to rob the Chemical State Bank in Midland, Michigan. A couple of weeks before the planned armed robbery, Jack had cased the bank and felt that it would be an easy hit. It was an early Wednesday morning on September 29, 1937. Anthony and his friend Jack drove to the Chemical State Bank in separate cars. Anthony was in a stolen car, while Jack drove a car that belonged to a friend. When the two met up, they ditched one of the vehicles and continued on their drive to the bank together in one car. It was now 11:30 a.m. Anthony, dressed in his denim blue jacket and a hat, walked alongside Jack towards the bank. He was armed with a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver, and Jack was also armed. When the men entered the bank, they were immediately met by the bank's president, 65-year-old Clarence McCumber. His 22-year-old daughter Claire was a bank employee and just so happened to be talking to her father when Jack and Anthony walked up to them. Jack took his gun, shoved it into Clarence's body, and the two began to struggle. Anthony began helping his accomplice and took his revolver and shot Clarence in the shoulder. Instead of hiding, 45-year-old Paul Bywater, who was a bank teller, left his station to aid Clarence, but he too was shot by Anthony. Clarence and Paul survived their wounds, but seeing that their plan would not be successful, Jack and Anthony left the scene of the crime. Hearing the commotion was a dentist by the name of Frank L. Hardy, who worked right next door to the bank. For his protection, and due to the fact that the Chemical State Bank had been robbed multiple times before, he always kept a fully loaded deer rifle in his office. He quickly ran to his window, and he noticed Anthony and Jack running away. He began shooting immediately, but by the time he started shooting, Anthony and his partner in crime had already made it to their getaway car, but they crashed because one shot Frank fired went through the getaway car's rear window and landed in Anthony's arm. Being wounded from the shot, Anthony crashed the car, and the accident caused Jack to fly out of the vehicle. Coincidentally, the car that they crashed into belonged to a woman by the name of Violet Venner, whose father was a sheriff and had actually convinced Frank to start bringing his hunting rifle to work for protection. Anthony got out of the car, went to help Jack, and during this time, Frank was still firing his rifle. Anthony began searching for where the bullets were coming from, and he saw 55-year-old truck driver Henry Porter, assumed he was the shooter, and shot in his direction. Henry was hit, collapsed on the floor, and laid there in critical condition. After shooting Henry, Anthony stopped a single mother in the car with her baby and forced her out of the car in order to steal her vehicle and drive off. Anthony was in the driver's seat, Jack was in the passenger seat, but the two did not get far because Frank was able to shoot the gas tank, causing the car to veer out of control. The men were on foot again and began running on a bridge. They thought they were in the clear, but Frank, who was approximately 150 yards away from the men, was able to aim straight for Jack as he was running. The shot made contact, and it landed right in the back of Jack's head, causing it to blow off. Continuing on without his friend, Anthony continued running alongside train tracks and was unsuccessful in trying to steal 2 more vehicles. He continued running and finally made it to where he and Jack had ditched their friend's car. He got in, but was too tired to drive or continue on with any type of escape. Sheriff Iris Smith was first on the scene and placed Anthony under arrest. Anthony was initially charged with attempted bank robbery, but unfortunately, the innocent bystander, Henry Porter, died from his wounds 12 days after he was shot. Because of his death, Anthony was now also charged with murder. With Anthony's luck of committing crimes after acts are put into motion, he was charged with a federal crime due to the National Bank Robbery Act that was enacted in 1934. Being that there was a murder in the process of him committing a federal crime, he was eligible for the death penalty. The judge presiding over his case was Judge Arthur Tuttle, and the trial was held at a federal court in Bay City. The trial lasted 3 days, and on October 29, 1937, exactly 1 month after his failed robbery attempt, the jury, consisting of 7 women and 5 men, found Anthony guilty. Judge Tuttle was the one who officially sentenced him to death. There were 34 witnesses, and Jack's widow appeared in court in support of Anthony. She came to court with her sister, who also happened to be the sister-in-law of Henry Porter, and she said that before Henry died, he said that he wanted Anthony to be spared from death. The doctor who treated Henry in the hospital, Dr. H.B. McCrory, was called to the stand. He said that on his dying bed, Henry said, "It's too bad one of us can't kick off so they can hang the dirty rat." Anthony's death sentence got the whole state of Michigan talking because the last execution in the state was in July of 1836 when Native American Waubow Namami was hanged for murder. The death penalty in Michigan was officially abolished in 1846, but the state had no say in his execution, being that it was a federal sentence. Governor Frank Murphy tried to bring this point up when fighting to get Anthony's execution sentence commuted to life in prison. Governor Frank pled to President Roosevelt and to Judge Tuttle as well, but neither agreed with giving Anthony a reprieve. One point made by Judge Tuttle was that treason was also punishable by death in the state of Michigan, so he would have been eligible for the death penalty if it was not a federal crime. Governor Murphy was quoted saying, "I deplore the fact that this execution is taking place within our state, where for more than a century there hasn't been a legal execution. It has always seemed to me that Michigan could take pride in being the first commonwealth on this earth to abolish capital punishment. I don't think it against the interest of the people of this state to oppose its revival by having the federal government come in here, erect a scaffold, and hang a man by the neck until he is dead. I think the federal government should have arranged for the execution elsewhere, if it was to take place anywhere." In response, Judge Tuttle said, "An able and fearless United States attorney fairly presented this case to a qualified jury of 5 men and 7 women, all good citizens of the state of Michigan. On October 28, 1937, that jury had the courage and wisdom to return the just verdict which directed that Chebotores be punished by death. That just verdict having been returned, the law was mandatory in 3 respects, namely that the penalty should be death, that it should be by hanging, and that it should be within the state of Michigan. These last 2 requirements resulted from the fact that Michigan has one statute providing the death penalty by hanging. If the sentence had been different in any one of those 3 respects, it would have been unlawful. I have neither the power nor the inclination to change the sentence. If I did have the power to do so, I think it would be unfair to suggest that the people of a neighboring state are less humane than are the people of our own state of Michigan. This federal court is enforcing a federal law in Michigan for an offense against the United States committed in Michigan." Many were fighting for Anthony, but it seemed like the only one who did not care and was not fighting was Anthony himself. It was said that during trial he barely talked to his defense team, but one thing that came out was that he said, "I haven't a friend in this world. My wife divorced me. I'd rather die than go back to prison." During trial, Anthony was initially locked up at the Saginaw County Jail, and it was reported that he got hold of a razor blade in an attempt to hurt himself. During trial, Anthony was initially locked up at the Saginaw County Jail, and it was reported that he got a hold of a razor blade in an attempt to hurt himself. Guards quickly saw what was happening and were able to disarm him, but even before his sentence, he knew in his heart he would be okay with death. While on death row, Anthony's defense team said that he did not have enough money nor the grounds to file for an appeal, but he was still given 7 months to do so. No appeal, however, was made on his behalf. When it was nearing Anthony's execution date, Frank Sain, a warden of Cook County Jail in Chicago, Illinois, offered to send an electric chair free of charge. "Our chair is ready for your use any time. We'll make no charge, of course. Always glad to oblige a neighbor." Anthony's execution date was set for July 8, 1938, and U.S. Marshal John J. Bark was in charge of handling the execution proceedings. He delegated G. Phil Hanna to carry out the hanging, and he was a 65-year-old farmer who had been in charge of over 70 executions. Sheriff Ira Smith, who was the one who arrested Anthony, was asked if he could attend the execution in order to open the trap door, and he agreed. In his last moments, although he had given up on life, his family, and had become an atheist, refusing to meet with the chaplain, he got a surprise visit from his ex-wife, his daughter, and her baby. By that time, his daughter was grown and married. Anthony was also able to see his son-in-law and his siblings as well. The prison offered to grant him a last meal, but he replied by saying, "I'll eat what the other fellows eat." According to an article by Aaron J. Veselinak, Phil Hanna arrived at the execution 3 hours early, but came with friends and was very drunk, struggling to even walk normal. Phil said that if his friends were not allowed to watch the execution, he would leave. The warden phoned the United States Bureau of Prisons to complain, but he was just told that there could only be official witnesses. Taking things into his own hands, he let Phil know his friends could stay, but once Phil left to prep for the execution, Warden John Ryan kicked the friends out without Phil even knowing. He did find out after the execution took place and got angry at the warden, but the warden kicked him out of the prison. The execution was held at the Federal Detention Farm, and Anthony was called out of his cell at 5:04 in the morning. Although he refused to see a spiritual advisor, there was a reverend that walked with him to the gallows. For Anthony's last words, he smiled and asked, "Are you Mr. Hanna?" Phil Hanna replied by saying, "I am," and Anthony said, "Then I know it will be a good job." The trap door sprung open, and Anthony was pronounced dead at 5:21 a.m. Anthony was the first person in the history of the United States to be sentenced to death under the Bank Robbery Act, and the first to go in Michigan in over 100 years. Thank you guys for watching another episode of Death Row Executions, and I would like to ask you guys a question. I was very shocked and surprised when I found out that his ex-wife and daughter went to visit him on death row. When his daughter was born, he was locked up for 6.5 years, and when he was released for 6 months, he made no effort to see her. He was locked up again for another 8 years, and when he was released, again, he made no effort to see his daughter. If you had a parent like that, would you be as forgiving as his daughter Vera and visit them on death row before their execution?